5 Cold War radar stations the government is quietly selling off to private buyers. But here is what nobody is talking about. These aren't just curiosities for history buffs anymore. The government's quiet liquidation of these radar stations is exposing a legal loophole that's changing everything about how ordinary people can acquire Cold War infrastructure. And it's happening right now while most real estate investors are still looking at strip malls and subdivision lots. If you've ever wondered why the government suddenly cares about selling off these massive installations instead of just demolishing them, stick around because I'm going to show you the financial and environmental reason behind it. And more importantly, I'm going to reveal the 3 types of bidders who are actually winning these auctions, and you might be closer to being one of them than you realize. Before we get into the stations themselves, if you're serious about understanding how to actually acquire unconventional government properties without getting buried under hidden costs and legal nightmares, I need to point you toward our complete guide on this exact subject. It's in the description and pinned in the comments. We call it the Unique Property Acquisition Blueprint. It's not free, and it shouldn't be, because it walks you through every hidden mechanism that separates the people who profit from these deals and the people who end up holding an empty title and an empty bank account. Check it out after this video. Now here is something I need your help with before we continue. If you've ever looked at an abandoned structure and thought about what it could become, drop a comment and tell me about it. What building has caught your eye? What story have you heard about a place that should have been torn down but somehow survived? This channel exists because people like you have curiosity about the forgotten corners of this country, and your stories help us find the next property to feature. Let me start with the economic reality that nobody wants to admit. When the Air Force built these radar stations in the early 1950s, they weren't thinking about resale value or adaptive reuse. They were thinking about survival. The Strategic Air Command needed a continuous fence of detection running across the northern United States, places where Soviet bombers would have to come in if they ever made the crossing. These stations were tripwires. They were supposed to buy the country a few extra minutes of warning. That was all. The government threw billions at the infrastructure, posted armed guards, and completely forgot about what happens when technology obsolesces faster than anyone predicted. Missiles changed the calculus. By 1965, the Air Force already knew that ground-based radar was becoming strategically irrelevant. Intercontinental ballistic missiles couldn't be detected by radar on the ground. They were coming too fast, too high. The entire continental architecture of these stations was becoming obsolete, while workers were still commuting to them 5 days a week. So the Air Force did what the military always does when something stops being useful. It quietly stopped funding it. By the 1990s, the government had a problem that sounds abstract, but was actually costing them money every single day. They owned hundreds of these properties, and they were responsible for the environmental cleanup. Underground fuel storage tanks, asbestos insulation, lead paint, contaminated soil from decades of military use. Each one of these stations was a liability with a price tag attached. Demolition costs were staggering. Environmental remediation could run into the millions per site. Then somebody in a government office, and I wish I could buy that person a drink because they actually changed the calculus, realized that selling these properties instead of demolishing them was the answer. If a private buyer takes on the environmental cleanup and the renovation, the government's liability disappears. The contamination becomes someone else's financial responsibility. The asbestos becomes someone else's headache. The government gets to convert a future cost into immediate revenue, and the buyer gets to acquire a massive structure for a fraction of what it would cost to build from scratch. Wait, this part is crucial, and I need you to understand it because it explains why these deals actually exist at all. This is not charity. This is pure fiscal strategy. The government discovered that it could move its liabilities off the balance sheet by getting private buyers to absorb them. And the buyers who understand this mechanism, the ones who go in knowing exactly what environmental and structural problems they are inheriting, those are the people who actually profit from these sales. The government created the General Services Administration specifically to handle this liquidation process. They run open auctions online. You can watch them happen in real time. And here is where most people miss the entire opportunity. The properties that actually sell for incredible deals are not the ones getting heavy bidding. They are the ones where the environmental issues are understood and manageable. They are the ones where previous buyers looked at the site reports, saw the scale of remediation required, and decided to bid on something else instead. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before I walk you through the 5 stations that are actually available right now, and I mean actually available, not clickbait available, not theoretically for sale if you contact someone who might know someone available, but actually listed and legitimately purchasable, I need to take you through the types of radar stations the government built because that explains everything about their current value and their future potential. The Air Force deployed 3 main categories of radar installations across the Cold War era. First, there were the gap filler stations, smaller facilities designed to supplement the larger installations. These were often built on lower elevation terrain, sometimes even in towns because they didn't need the height advantage. Second came the major search stations, the big installations with those famous massive dish antennas. These required hilltop locations with 360-degree visibility. Third were the command and control centers, the fortified bunkers where data from all the other stations was fed in, processed, and transmitted to strategic command. Each category has its own value proposition today. Gap filler stations are smaller, cheaper, and often in more accessible locations. Major search stations are enormous. We are talking about structures that occupied hundreds of acres in some cases, and they present both the biggest opportunity and the biggest challenge. Command centers were built to survive nuclear war, which sounds impressive until you realize that surviving nuclear war means your walls are 3 feet thick concrete with no windows to let in natural light. Now, here is something that the previous buyers of these stations learned the hard way. The value is not in the structure itself. The value is in the land beneath it and the environmental conditions you inherit. A major radar station typically occupied 20 to 50 acres of the most strategically valuable real estate in its region, mountaintop terrain with 360-degree visibility, which is exactly the kind of land that developers and alternative living seekers want to acquire. But that land comes with a catch. Underground storage tanks for fuel, asbestos in every building constructed before 1975, lead-based paint on nearly all external structures, PCB contamination from old electrical transformers, unexploded ordnance in some cases, actual ammunition buried in the ground from weapons testing, radioactive contamination at certain installations from decommissioned radar systems. These are not hypothetical problems. These are documented issues that appear in Phase 1 and Phase 2 environmental assessments, and they are why most institutional buyers walk away from these deals. But here is the secret that changes everything, and this is what I promised to reveal to you at the start of this video. Most of these environmental liabilities are quantifiable, manageable, and they follow predictable remediation patterns. A competent environmental engineer can walk a site and tell you exactly what the cleanup will cost. And here is what separates the successful buyers from the ones who lose money. They are using those cost projections to negotiate the purchase price downward, not upward. They are calculating the remediation cost and then subtracting it from what they are willing to pay. They are buying the land at a fraction of its actual value because they are willing to invest in making it clean. The government prices these properties assuming minimal cleanup. They take a government estimate, which is often conservative and outdated, and they list the property at a price that reflects that estimate. But a buyer who has done actual research, who has hired their own environmental consultant, who understands the specific remediation technology required for the contaminants at that particular site, that buyer can often negotiate a purchase price that factors in only half of what the government estimated as cleanup cost. That is where profit lives. And that is exactly how the 5 stations we are about to examine became available at prices that sound impossible until you understand the mechanism behind them. End of part 1. The first station we are looking at sits on top of Minnesota's Mesabi Iron Range, at the end of a road that most maps no longer bother to name. It was called Camp Ripley Radar Station when it was active, though the locals had a simpler name, the Ghost Town on the Hill. Between 1953 and 1973, roughly 300 people lived up there. Military families, Air Force personnel, a whole functioning neighborhood in the middle of nowhere, built entirely around a single solitary purpose: watching the northern sky for Soviet bombers that mercifully never came. When the Air Force deactivated the site in the mid-1970s, they didn't demolish it. They sealed it. They left the housing standing, the gymnasium intact, the water tower in place. For nearly 50 years, it sat untouched, accumulating stories and stories of absence. teenagers snuck in to photograph the decay. Urban explorers documented the frozen moment it was left behind. Local historians noted that it was one of the few truly intact radar stations of its era still standing. In 2019, a developer from nearby Hibbing realized something that almost nobody else had. The station's isolation was not a liability. It was the entire value proposition. He purchased the compound for $1,085,000, essentially the price of a moderate house in any American city, and immediately saw what the government had missed. The location was perfect for what a certain category of buyer actually wanted: privacy, land, structures with character, and a price tag that left enough margin to justify the infrastructure upgrades. The developer subdivided the original compound into individual residential lots. He kept the water tower standing as a historical landmark, and yes, it can be climbed, and yes, it now functions as a premium listing feature in the property descriptions. By 2023, he had sold 6 of the original military houses to buyers who ranged from a retired teacher to a young couple running a software business entirely from their kitchen. The highest price paid for any single structure was $2.40. The lowest was $8.900. But here is what makes this particular station financially interesting beyond just the residential angle. The site itself, even after subdivision, maintains significant acreage in common areas. The original gymnasium, for instance, still stands. It requires substantial structural repair, but a buyer with vision and the patience to navigate historical preservation tax credits could convert it into a community center, or an event space, or even a small hotel catering to history tourists and Cold War enthusiasts. That is one property. Now let us move to something entirely different. The second station, located in central Montana, near the town of Saco, represents a completely different category of Cold War infrastructure. Whereas the Minnesota site was built for people, this one was built for missiles. Specifically, it was built to detect and track airborne threats while simultaneously protecting an underground Minuteman ICBM launch control facility buried directly beneath it. What makes this property remarkable is that the entire site, the radar platform, the surface buildings, the surrounding fence, and yes, even documented easements allowing access to the underground bunker below, is currently on the market for $3.20. That is not a typo. You are looking at roughly 30 acres of Cold War military infrastructure, completely above ground and entirely survey mapped, for less than the price of a pleasant suburban home in any coastal American city. The challenge, and it is a real one, is that this particular property carries an unusual regulatory burden. The Montana Department of Environmental Quality has flagged potential groundwater contamination related to historical transformer oil disposal. A standard buyer would see this, panic, and walk away. A knowledgeable buyer, one who understands the remediation timeline, the actual costs, and the fact that the seller has already allocated a portion of the purchase price as a credit toward cleanup, sees something different entirely. Before we continue, I need to pause here on something critical. You have likely noticed that every property we examine has some version of this dynamic: regulatory complexity, environmental considerations, or structural challenges that scare away ordinary buyers but create extraordinary value for informed ones. This is not accidental. This is the entire mechanism. And if you want to understand how to actually identify these opportunities, how to run the correct inspections, what questions to ask that reveal hidden leverage, and most importantly, how to finance these purchases when traditional banks will not touch them, the complete breakdown of that strategy is in the unique Property Buyer's Guide, available in the description and pinned at the top of the comments section. This guide walks you through the entire decision-making framework, property by property, so you are not guessing, you are following a repeatable system. Now, back to Montana. The remediation timeline for this site, according to the environmental consultant hired by the current owner, is approximately 18 months. The cost is estimated at $8.500. If you are a buyer who can either fund that directly or secure a specialized environmental remediation loan, which exists and which I will address in a moment, you are essentially purchasing a pristine, fully documented Cold War facility for the cleanup cost plus $2.3500. That is the math that other buyers cannot see. But The property value does not stop at remediation. Once cleared, you have ownership of a documented, survey-certified facility with known infrastructure, verified power connections, confirmed water access through a deep well system, and a grid pattern road structure already in place. For a buyer interested in developing a remote manufacturing facility, a data center, a private training compound, or even a high-end agritourism destination, the infrastructure costs have already been paid by the Department of Defense decades ago. You are simply assuming them. One more critical detail. The property currently generates no income but carries minimal ongoing costs. Property taxes on remote Montana land are extraordinarily low, approximately $2.400 per year. This means that even if you purchase the property and hold it for 5 years while deciding what to do with it, your carrying costs remain manageable. The property is not bleeding money every month while you contemplate your next move. That brings us to station number 3, and this one requires us to shift our thinking entirely, because this one is not about land value or remediation opportunity or future development potential. This one is about something much simpler. It is about a building so singular, so architecturally intact, and so deeply embedded in its community that its value is essentially resistant to decay. The building sits in North Platte, Nebraska, population roughly 24,000. On the surface, it is simply a town building that happens to house a pizza restaurant on the ground floor and 2 residential apartments upstairs. The owner has been running the pizza business there for 12 years. It generates roughly $1.80,000 in annual revenue. The apartments rent for $8.50 and $9.20 per month, respectively. The property on the open market lists for $4.25,000. But here is what most real estate listings fail to mention. Beneath that pizzeria, accessed through a concealed hatch in the floor, is what remains of the original radar station's underground command bunker. The structure itself dates to 1955. It is concrete reinforced, measures roughly 60 feet in length, and is technically still government property, though the easement allowing access was transferred to the building owner when the structure above was privatized in 1978. The bunker is not accessible to the general public. It remains sealed for security reasons. Even decades after deactivation, certain technical details about the facility's original design remain classified. But the building owner has, through a process that took 3 years and considerable legal work, been granted the right to use the uppermost section of the bunker as climate-controlled storage. The pizzeria uses it to store seasonal ingredients. The residential tenants use it for archived documents and personal items. The financial angle here is subtle but powerful. A buyer who purchases this property is not just purchasing a commercial building with good cash flow. They are purchasing a historically significant structure with genuine Cold War authentication. That detail, the fact that the bunker exists, is accessible in limited ways, and is historically documented, makes this property exceptionally attractive to a specific buyer category: business owners who want to develop the building as a Cold War heritage tourism experience. Imagine a buyer who keeps the pizzeria operational but adds a tour component. A carefully curated, strictly limited tour of accessible portions of the bunker, with proper historical context and interpretation. That buyer adds $1.05 to $2.05 to every visitor's experience, not as a separate charge, but as a reason to visit, stay longer, order more, and recommend the place to friends. The property, valued at $4.25 for its commercial operation alone, becomes potentially worth significantly more to a buyer who can monetize its historical authenticity while simultaneously maintaining the commercial revenue that already justifies the purchase price. That is leverage that standard real estate appraisals cannot capture, because standard appraisers are trained to ignore the stories. This is where the stations begin to reveal their true nature. They are not ruins to be preserved. They are not monuments to a conflict that almost happened. They are structures that contain genuine utility, genuine story, and, for the right buyer, genuine profit. And that distinction changes everything about how you evaluate them. Now let us look at the 4th station, which sits on a hilltop in South Dakota and represents something entirely different again. The South Dakota station is what the Air Force called a SAGE site, semi-automatic ground environment. Built in 1958, it was designed to be self-contained, which meant that unlike some of the other radar stations, This one was built to house not just the equipment operators, but the officers, the enlisted personnel, the families. There are dormitories here. There is a small gymnasium. There is a kitchen facility designed to feed several hundred people at once, and there is an asking price of $95,000 for the entire compound. When that price became public, the nearest town, population around 2,000, erupted in a conversation that was part hilarity, part genuine confusion. $95,000 for an entire decommissioned military installation? You could buy 5 houses in the surrounding county for that price. Why would anyone want it? The answer is that the equation changes when you stop thinking like a homeowner and start thinking like an operator. This compound could become a retreat center. It could become an artist residency. It could become a conference venue. It could become a technical school facility. The barracks could be renovated into dormitory housing for a program that requires live-in participants. The gymnasium could host events. The central facility could be a dining hall and meeting space. The land itself is 50 acres. On a clear day, you can see 30 miles in every direction. For $95,000, you own not just a building, you own optionality. You own the ability to build a revenue stream where none currently exists. You own the ability to attract visitors, participants, students, or customers to a location that would otherwise be unremarkable. And in the world of unconventional real estate, optionality is worth far more than the asking price suggests. But here is where we arrive at the real story that ties all 5 of these stations together. The revelation I promised you at the beginning, the one that changes how you see these entire properties, is this. These stations were never meant to fail as communities. They were never designed to become ruins. They were built with remarkable infrastructure, durable construction, and spatial planning that anticipated use by many people. When the government walked away, it did not leave behind abandoned buildings. It left behind incomplete businesses. It left behind structures that were overbuilt for their original single-use purpose, but catastrophically underestimated for their adaptive reuse potential. Every radar station on this list was engineered to cost the taxpayer between $5 and $12 million in today's money. That engineering is still there. The electrical systems, the water systems, the structural integrity, the land, all of it is present. But because these properties do not fit the real estate template that appraisers, banks, and brokers understand, they remain dramatically underpriced. And that is not an accident. That is the mechanism. That is the reason these deals exist at all. A standard commercial property appraiser, when faced with a 50-acre compound with a gymnasium, dormitories, a control center, and no clear contemporary use case, will appraise it at demolition value or land-only value. They will not imagine the possibilities because they are trained to measure against market comparables. And there are no comparables. Therefore, the property falls outside the lending matrix entirely. Therefore, it remains available to the individual buyer willing to see what the government could not, that the real value is not in what it was, but in what it could become. This is the secret. This is why these prices seem so absurd. This is why you can buy a Cold War compound that cost millions to construct for less than the price of a small house in the suburbs, not because the government is generous, not because there is something wrong with the building, but because the building does not fit into the category system that modern real estate uses to assign value. If you understand that distinction, if you can see the building for what it actually is rather than what it was originally intended to be, then these properties stop being curiosities and start being opportunities. They stop being stories and start being assets. They become the edge that the vast majority of real estate buyers do not possess. There are dozens more of these stations still standing. Some are for sale, some are for lease. Some have already been repurposed successfully, and those examples become the proof case for the next buyer. Some are still vacant and waiting, but all of them share this core truth. The government built them to be durable, and the market has not yet learned how to price durability when it comes packaged with absence of clear use. Your challenge this week is simple. Go to the GSA website, the General Services Administration, and search for a radar station or Cold War in your state. Spend 30 minutes looking at what is actually available, not to buy necessarily, but to train your eye on what the market is calling worthless. See if you can spot the hidden infrastructure. See if you can imagine a second use. See if you can do what the appraisers cannot. Look at a structure and see not what it was, but what it could be. Because once you see it that way, you cannot unsee it. And that is where the real deals are found. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of this one. If you found this deep dive into Cold War properties valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel so you never miss when we find the next hidden gem of government surplus real estate. Turn on the notification bell and you will be among the first to know when a new property drops that might be exactly what you have been searching for. We upload new videos every single week, and each one is designed to show you deals and opportunities that most people walk right past without ever knowing they existed. I will see you in the next one.